Okay, so we're just going to go through a quick PowerPoint discussing the Indian Act. This is just a little infographic based off a book called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. Again, this PowerPoint is available for you online. It's in your Google Classroom, as are the notes we just went over. Okay. Indian Act was created in 1876. It demonstrates the way the Canadian government understood treaty rights. Numbered treaties mean the government has a duty to protect the collective rights of First Nations people. The Indian Act was just one of the ways that the government undertook this duty. So important notes there, you might want to include that Indian Act was created in 1876, and it dictates the relationship between the Canadian government and First Nations people. It's kind of what this slide is telling us. So I see many of you are writing notes. Please don't write every word you see on this slide. Okay, it's not necessary. I'm going to move on just so we can get through this. So we have less time today and then we have to go to Mass. So just a little recap. Indian agents, what do? They monitor and, they're liaisons from the government to the reserve. Okay, so they're kind of in charge of what is going on the reserve. These agents had the power to individually decide how to carry out the government's duties. This meant there were many interpretations of what treaty rights meant and how they were applied. Okay. Indian agent might be one of your key words in your document. Let's make sure to pick those notes up there. You're gonna tap her shoulder. Huh? Let's pick up our notes off the ground and maybe put them somewhere where you won't lose them. So Indian agents clearly have a lot of control individually. They have a lot of power to just, interpret these rules however they want and implement them how they want, as we discussed in the previous note there as well. They're in charge of a lot of things that occur on a reserve. So, the slide says Canada's government thought they had the right to make laws about and decisions for First Nations without consulting them. That's a complicated history there. As the people who are settling in Canada start to, formulate a country, it's not clear to me why they didn't invite Indigenous people to the table during those discussions. Could have been due to, racist or ethnocentric ideas. Do we understand what ethnocentrism is? It's kind of like preferring your own group over others, valuing your group more, or thinking your group is superior. Okay. But some people might say that, they're attempting to make a country, so they have the right to do whatever they want. Particularly if a lot of these conflicts are solved using violence historically, while the winning group is going to decide what happens. That's pretty common of conflict and warfare all across the globe, not just by European people. So, the Act outlines who may be registered as a status Indian with treaty rights. Okay, so that's part of its process. If you kind of look at how they explain how a person is considered Indian, it's both bizarre and fascinating at the same time. I mean, a lot of it is based on this idea of like blood. So, if your mom and dad are both Indigenous, then you'd be considered Indigenous or Indian, as they would have called it. But they had a lot of various strange rules about, if a woman were to marry outside of her tribe, or if your dad was this and your mom was that, or if your mom was this and your dad was that. And so strangely enough, they didn't go based off maternal relationships, they went based off paternal relationships. which is kind of bizarre if you think about it. Like, without DNA testing, you kind of really only know who the mother is, and yet, you know, they chose to make these decisions based off, you know, paternal relationships rather than maternal. Okay. The Indian Act does give the kind of control over Indigenous affairs to the federal government. You know, and that's kind of the process that they used to act out any of these treaty rights and how they dealt with Indigenous groups. So there is a desire at some level, I'm sure many Indigenous groups, many Indigenous peoples want some things to be updated. Although I think many Indigenous groups might not want things changed either. You know, it's kind of complicated to speak for this many different groups. Part of the complication is, you know, if they do make any changes, consulting all those groups is going to be a big challenge. You know, kind of comes down to the same question of, do you think all 30 of you can agree on one thing to do? Right? And if the 30 of you can agree on it, do you think all the grade 9s can agree on, you know, one good change, right? So it gets very complicated when there's large groups of people. The other fear that third point's acknowledging is that if you start kind of changing things like Pierre Trudeau, so Justin Trudeau's dad tried some process like this when they were making the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution and whatnot, and many Indigenous groups were opposed to having Indigenous people in Canada being treated just like any other Canadian. You know, they wanted their collective rights, partly just to acknowledge that their own unique history in the land and the role that they played in the creation of the country and history and whatnot. So updating these legal documents that are very old, that protect some people's rights, can be very complicated. More modern understanding, you know, people in America particularly, they're always very vocal about their rights and whatnot, particularly their Second Amendment right, you know, when it comes to gun control, and who can and cannot have access to guns. You know, so these debates can be very complicated, and it's usually difficult to change these documents. So part of the issue with the Indian Act and just how Canada dealt with Indigenous groups is that Indigenous groups always wanted to remain sovereign. That's kind of what this second point here is discussing. They wanted their own governance. They wanted to be autonomous because that's kind of how they were prior to European contact, prior to colonialism. Many of these tribes had their own leadership structures, which might change depending on their circumstances. You know, particularly, some tribes changed their leadership structure if they were in war with another group, or if it was peace times, or certain things were going on. But as soon as Canada is formed as a country, well, the way countries operate or kingdoms operate is that whoever's in charge, they're in charge of everyone. Doesn't matter what different groups are in there. Right? So for many Indigenous people, they probably wouldn't have liked that. Okay, this third point here, an Indian was defined as any male person of Indian blood and their children. Status women who married non-status men lost their status and treaty rights. Non-status women who married a status man gained full status and treaty rights. So, you know, if you're an Indigenous woman and you, let's say, marry a white guy, all of a sudden you've lost all of your connections to your treaty rights, and you wouldn't be considered an Indian by the government, right? So bizarrely, they're just changing the definition of who people are based on a legal document rather than, you know, genetics or DNA, which, you know, obviously didn't have back then in 1876. As mentioned before, it's also kind of bizarre that they went through the paternal, the male line, because you know, everyone knows who their mother is, but not everyone's going to know who their dad is, right? And yet, you know, they chose to define that by the male bloodline. Okay. Additionally, I found this last point rather disturbing when I learned about it. So, for many Indigenous people, if they, you know, went to university, or if they here it indicates if they got a degree as a doctor, a lawyer, or a clergyman, which would be like a pastor or preacher, they lost their status. So, it's kind of like a crabs in a bucket situation of like if you try to crawl out of this bad situation, get yourself educated, you lose your Indian status, right? So you're no longer connected to your people, right? And for a group of people that their family and tribal connections are very important, you can imagine that might deter many people from, becoming a doctor, becoming a lawyer, right? You're fine to walk there. What's up? Sure. And just go out that side. There's space up there. Additionally, the Indian Act and a lot of the documentation. So again, remember we looked at our various rights. So in Canada, part of your mobility rights includes the right to move somewhere else and earn a living there, right? These are all rights granted to Canadians, particularly citizens, right? But for Indigenous people, for many of them, they didn't have a lot of mobility rights. So if they wanted to leave their reserve, they would have to get a permit from their Indian agent requesting, like, hey, can I go over here and do this? So let's say you had a ceremony where you go and visit your ancestors' graves and they're buried somewhere far away because maybe they died somewhere far away.